I tightened the plastic cuffs around my father's wrists until the ridged edge bit into his skin. The radiator pipe behind him was the only thing in the basement that still felt dependable. Old steel, bolted straight into the concrete before I was born. Everything else was cables and compromises. A folding table with mismatched legs, 2 camping chairs, a portable battery stack with a Resistance logo painted on in a shaky hand. The neural rig spread out like something half medical, half burglary kit. My father watched me over the tape I'd pressed across his mouth. His eyes were wet and furious. That was good. The puppets imitated anger but never quite got the pacing right. They were like badly dubbed actors, 3 frames off. "Try not to thrash," I told him. "I need clean data." His reply came out as a crushed growl behind the tape. I pretended not to understand. I wasn't ready to hear anything that sounded like my father. In the stories people told in the cell, the invasion always came with spectacle. Ships hanging over capitals, beams turning highways into glass, a countdown in news tickers. What arrived instead on a Tuesday afternoon that looked like any other started as a hiccup on the feeds and rolled into half the world's eyes going wrong. The sky stayed clear. The streets stayed ordinary. The feeds kept streaming until an instant when people arguing over ration points or traffic or football froze mid-breath, and their expressions emptied and refilled with something that wore them like software. We called them ghosted because nobody liked naming what might be underneath. I looped the electrode band around my own left wrist and cinched it down. The pad was cold. A spiral of hair beneath it stuck flat against my skin. The rig was simple in theory: a borrowed medical headset to watch brainwaves, a cheap wrist sensor to catch nerve activity from the arm, and a signal analyzer I'd built out of scavenged parts and cracked software. The headset and wristband fed into the analyzer, which searched for a pattern the Resistance manuals called a cascade signature, a distinctive stutter that appeared when an alien process hopped across human nerves. In practice, the manuals were snapshots from labs that had fallen early. They were all we had. I eased the headset over my father's hair and adjusted the contact pads against his scalp. The cable trailed back to the analyzer, a thin, dark line that looked too much like a leash. "You remember why the radiator?" I asked. "You used to lean against this thing in winter. You hated the way the heat cycled." His fingers tugged once at the cuffs. It could have been an answer, or just discomfort. When the feeds first cut, I'd been on my 3rd straight 12-hour shift in the cell's signal room, eyes raw from data. I remember looking up and seeing the news anchor on the old wall screen finish a joke in a different voice. That was the first off note. Then our chat lines filled with reports. Kids at a playground going still mid-game, half rising, half frozen, then resuming in eerie synchrony. Traffic cameras catching drivers who didn't react to horns or crashes around them for those first few heartbeats. Our block went 1 in 2. Every second person ghosted. Some families split down the middle. My father had been at home. The building log marked his biometric status as normal. The cell's first triage pass cleared him. Yesterday, in a cross-check of old data against new ghosting algorithms, his name lit up in amber. Someone in the cell joked that it was neat that the tech guy's father was the edge case. Someone else muttered that it made testing more efficient. I volunteered before they asked. If my father was ghosted, I wanted to be the one who proved it. If he was clean, I could protect him better with hard data. That was the line I fed myself as I dragged him down the cracked concrete stairs, one hand on his elbow and one bunching his jacket at the shoulder, ignoring the neighbor's doors tightening shut. Now, in the dim basement, with one bare bulb hanging from a cable, that justification felt thin. I tapped the analyzer screen. The software I'd written booted up in a washed-out green interface. Idle waves crawled along the graphs. My own baseline, my father's. No cascade yet. The manuals said to start with a simple handshake burst, a short signal sent through the device's own wiring to see if anything on the other end answered. "I'm sending a ping," I told him, then let the words stand. He might as well know the shape of what was happening. "It won't hurt. It's just a probe." He stared at me. A drop of sweat traced down his temple. I tapped the key to start the handshake. On the monitor, my baseline jumped as the rig measured the artificial pulse we sent. Expected. My body was part of the circuit. A moment later, my father's line should have shown the same gentle bump, a delayed mirror. Instead, a jagged spike ripped through both traces at once, my channel and his, taller and sharper than any reference pattern. The software chirped and painted both channels bright red. A text alert flashed up, one I'd only ever seen in training scenarios. Cascade signature, severe, primary event. For a moment, every checklist and doctrine page I'd memorized went blank. I had to force my thoughts back into their usual grooves, back to what the manuals said this meant. Resistance doctrine was simple. A clean human profile stayed flat, no cascade at all. A ghosted puppet showed a weak, crooked signature when probed. A strong cascade meant something else entirely. Seed node, the notes called it. Anchor host. Someone installed at the center of a cluster, coordinating others. I watched the red lines shudder and settle back to baseline. Training told me to log the event and move on. Instead, I stalled, focusing on the radiator pipe behind my father, counting the patches of rust. He stared at the monitor, then at me. "Don't look at that," I told him. "Look at me." I peeled the tape off his mouth. It came away with a crackle. His lips were raw where the adhesive had clung. "What have you done, Lewis?" He didn't inflect it like a question. That was the worst part. He knew me well enough to assume I'd done something. "It's the standard protocol." The word slipped out before I caught it. "Protocol." He rolled it in his mouth. "You jam a probe into my head without even telling me what I'm accused of. You were flagged in the sweep." I kept my eyes on the monitor, scrolling back through the handshake log. Biometric anomalies near 3 broadcast events. Elevated heart rate at every emergency siren. A mismatch between your clinic records and your building access times. So I'm guilty of having a bad ticker and being near loudspeakers. You know it isn't that simple. He lifted his bound hands a few centimeters, the cuffs biting down again, then let them fall against the radiator. Metal creaked, the sound bouncing off the low ceiling and coming back thin. "I remember the day you brought that thing home." He nodded at the analyzer. "You were proud of the solder joints. Your mother would have called it junk." "My mother isn't here. Her absence lived in the walls more than in my thoughts." "You are, and the rig says you're compromised." He studied me, chest rising and falling slow. "The rig, not you. The rig is reading your brainwaves and nerve responses. I'm just interpreting." "And that spike you just saw?" he asked. "That's me." "It's both of us." I zoomed into the graph, tracing the lines with my fingertip. "But when we test for ghosting, we only care about the subject line." "You said both of us." I killed the display. "The first readings are noisy. We'll rerun them after we've got a baseline." He huffed, incredulous. "You lock me to the radiator, tape my mouth, fry my head with gadgets, and you call this a baseline? The alternative is someone else in the cell does this without the history between us. Trust me, you don't want that." He leaned his head back against the concrete wall, looking up at the single bulb. It still swung a little from our earlier scuffle, light moving in a slow arc across his face. "All right," he muttered. "Run your tests, boy. Ask your questions." I powered the monitor back on and opened a fresh session. The manuals recommended starting with what they called context checks. Personal history, specific enough that only a true human memory carried all the small errors and moods. The puppets were good at remembering facts they could scrape. They faltered on texture. I dragged the second chair closer and sat facing him. We'll start with childhood. I slipped my hands under the table so he wouldn't see what they were doing. Easier that way. You hated childhood stories, he reminded me. You used to bolt from the room when your uncles talked about you wetting your pants on the tram. You're not helping yourself. He pushed his shoulders back against the wall. Ask then. Construction site, you remember? He gave me a look. You mean the day you tried to climb the scaffolding 3 streets over and ended up with your leg torn open? Details, I pressed. Which street? How did you find me? It was the old Market Street near the tram line. I heard from the neighbour's kid you were bragging about getting up to the 3rd level. By the time I got there, the security guard had hauled you down. You slipped on plaster dust and cut your shin on a nail. You refused the ambulance because you thought it'd be cool to limp home instead. My fingers stopped their restless tapping. On some level, I'd expected the story to be right, but not this right. He even remembered the plaster grit, the way it clung to my trousers. And what did you say when I told you the scar would stay? I asked. He grimaced. You said it'd make you look like the sort of engineer who actually does things, not like the ones who sit at desks. That isn't quite how I remember it. You're editing people even in your own past. He was right. In my version, the line was smarter. In his, it was just childish bravado, the way I'd really been. The graph on the monitor showed lazy, overlapping waves, no sign of cascade. I moved on. School prank, the registry hack. He snorted. Prank, sure. That was pure ego. You rewrote the attendance record so your whole class looked perfect for the month. You wanted to prove to that math teacher that her tracking system could be fooled. You came in furious when the principal called, I prompted. You bet I was. You only switched the data for your class. You could have hit the whole school and nobody would have noticed. He shifted against the radiator, metal groaning. I told you, if you're going to break something, commit. That's what pissed me off, not the hack. The halfway job so your friends would think you were clever. The word hit an old bruise that had nothing to do with the invasion. The graph stayed calm. We went on like that. The scar behind my right ear from when he misjudged a haircut and nicked me with the clippers. The day we spent fixing the antenna on the roof. Me more interested in the view than the bolts. The arguments over my obsession with feed monitors. He was accurate in ways no outside process should be. Not just the facts, but the cadence of those days. The way I used to stomp down the hallway when I was angry. The way he could tell I'd been up all night from the dishes I left in the sink. Every memory we checked came back green on the rig, clean of cascades or stutters. For a moment, the scenario tree in my head shifted. Fewer branches ended with execution. The basement air still pressed in, but some of the panic thinned. Then I scrolled back to the very first handshake spike, sitting there in red, and any sense of reprieve folded in on itself. Your toy doesn't like me. My father nodded at the frozen spike. My toy isn't meant to like anything. I kept my gaze on the screen. It's meant to measure. And what exactly does a big red mountain mean? That your nervous system carries a pattern we associate with ghosting. Based on what? The feeds you've got left scraped and scrambled by whatever did this. That's enough. The edge in my voice surprised even me. You'll answer the questions. You'll hold still when I say to. You don't get to second-guess the only tools we have to survive. He inhaled slowly through his nose, then let the air out through his teeth. You're right. I should put my faith in the boy who used to rig his own test scores for fun. I leaned forward. The boy who keeps you off the street sweep lists, whose clearance is the reason you're still in this building, not dragged to an assessment center. He closed his eyes. Fine. What now? Now I see how you react under pain. The stim unit was a square metal box the size of my palm. It linked into the rig between the headset and the analyzer. Originally, it treated neuropathy, sending small pulses to retrain damaged nerves. The cell had repurposed it as a probe. I flicked the connect switch and felt the relay click under my finger. "This will hurt," I warned. "Short bursts only. I'll ramp slowly." "Do you remember when you dislocated your shoulder?" he asked suddenly. "I was 15, I answered automatically, trying to show off on the monkey bars. "I remember you refused the painkillers at first. You wanted to see how much you could manage. You told the medic you needed to know your own thresholds for science. And your point. You're like that now. You're not testing me. You're testing your toy and yourself. Maybe I'm doing all three. Brace yourself." I turned the dial. His back arched. His fingers clawed at the cuffs. A sound tore out of his throat that didn't belong in that room. He hunched forward, forehead nearly hitting his knees. The headset shifted on his scalp and I reached out to steady it. On the monitor, his channel and mine both spiked, then settled into a ragged pattern. His responses delayed, mine slightly ahead. I tapped the dial down and counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3. He slumped, breathing harsh, sweat beading at his brow. "You all right?" "Do you hear yourself?" he wheezed. "You do this to me and then you ask if I'm all right. I need clean data. If you jerk too much, the readings blur." He managed a laugh, thin and hard. "You sound like your clinic reports. Subject exhibited distress. The way they wrote about your mother when the diagnostics started failing. The old report language flashed in my head, cold bullet points where she had been, and I pushed it away before it could spool through. I turned the dial again. This time I watched the graphs instead of him. My line jumped a fraction of a second before his. When he flinched, the spike on my wrist channel was already dropping. I noted the delay, the difference in amplitude. Again. "Stop this," he groaned. "Stop torturing yourself for me." "It's not torture if it tells us what we need." "Oh, you've learned some interesting vocabulary with your new friends." He jerked again as the current flowed. His knees knocked the underside of the table. The battery stack rattled. On the third pulse, I saw something I couldn't explain. Just before the stim kicked, my hand twitched toward the dial as if adjusting it on its own. A small, involuntary move, half motion and half intention. The kind of thing you do when you know what comes next and your body prepares without waiting for permission. "Did you feel that?" my father rasped. "You're the one taking the current." "I mean in you. Don't pretend you didn't." I let go of the dial and stepped back, forcing my hands open and closed until the tingling in my fingers faded. "The rig is a loop," I said. "Our nerves are tied together by the circuitry. Some bleed through is normal. You're stuttering. You never stutter when you talk about circuits." The observation landed heavier than any pulse. I pushed the stim dial to 0 and disconnected the box. I needed a moment without his eyes on me. "I'm going upstairs to check in," I told him. "You stay put." He looked pointedly at the cuffs. "I'll wander the city instead." I tore a strip of tape and pressed it back over his mouth. His muffled protest followed me halfway up the stairs. The stairwell was narrow and chipped, paint peeling down in long curls. On the landing, an old screen played the city feed at low volume. The sound had cut when the power flipped earlier and now crawled back in watery bursts, like someone tuning a radio between channels. On the screen, a presenter with eyes too wide and smile too smooth talked about cooperation quotas. Behind him, drone footage of streets lined with people in orderly rows, men and women, 1 in 2, moving in lockstep to some schedule I couldn't see. I turned away and keyed my handheld to the secure band. Victor answered on the third ping. "You in place. In the basement under my block. Subject restrained. Initial tests running. Any obvious glitches?" "No motor anomalies," I said. "Speech timing normal. Baseline responses match expected human norms." "Don't try to impress me with clinic talk." Victor grunted. "I need a clear verdict by tonight, ghosted or not. If you have doubt, you treat him as ghosted." A line from Doctrine surfaced. When sweep deadlines collide with uncertainty, the sweep wins. Tonight isn't much time to build a full profile. We don't have full profiles anymore. We've got work shifts and power outages and patrols. The purge crews are clearing streets in your sector tomorrow. If he's flagged and still in your building when they sweep, they'll drag him to the center. You know what happens there. I pictured the assessment center 3 blocks over, the metal gates, the lines of men being marched in and fewer coming out. Understood. One more thing. Victor's tone lost what little softness it had. Since it's your father, the council insisted we run you through the gauntlet again too. The gauntlet was what the cell called the tests they put every recruit through to screen for ghosting. Memory drills, reflex tracks, neural scans. I'd already been through it twice. Passing the second time had given me my current clearance. I just did a round last week. New thresholds, new filters. You know how it is. Comms picked up chatter about seed nodes. We can't assume the ghosts only ride strangers' minds. The techs updated the scanners. I looked at my reflection in the stairwell window. Unshaven jaw, eyes set too deep from sleepless nights, hair shoved flat by the headset band earlier. Nothing in that face looked alien. That was the point. When? We bring the portable scanner to you. No room to argue in his voice. We swing by in a few hours. You keep him there, you run your little rig, you log everything. When we arrive, we do the clean scan, take him off your hands and clear you again. Then everyone can breathe easier. I knew at least 3 lies inside that last sentence. I bit them back. Copy. Good. And Lewis. Yes. If you can't bring yourself to deliver the verdict we need, tell me now. I'll send someone else, and you can sit upstairs with the neighbors and pretend nothing's happening. I could feel the accusation aimed at the part of me that still kept looking for a way out. He's my father. That's exactly why I should be the one to test him. I know where he'd slip. Then get to work. The line cut. The news presenter on the screen was still talking. His mouth moved, but the sound glitched half a word behind. For an instant, his face froze while his voice carried on, words spilling out of a still image. Then the sync snapped back into place. No one in the hallway noticed. The few neighbors still living on my floor had their doors closed, their peepholes covered. I caught my own reflection again. For a second, my eyes looked lighter than they should, a few shades off. It could have been the screen flicker. It could have been nothing. When I stepped back into the basement, my father was humming through his nose, some old song he used to drill into me when we worked on the antenna together. The tape over his mouth turned it into a dull noise. "Stop that," I muttered. "You'll throw off the rig." He glared and subsided. I replayed the last few minutes of the session on my body cam to file with the cell. The video showed me attaching the stim unit, ramping it up, my father twisting against the cuffs. Then something wrong rolled across the small screen. In the clip, during one of the pulses, my voice flattened into a tone I didn't recognize. I watched myself lean close to my father and say, in a calm, almost gentle voice, "Subject displays high resilience. Recommend escalation." I had no memory of choosing those words. In my recollection, I'd simply muttered about needing clean data. Even stranger, my face on the footage looked peculiarly still as I spoke. The lines beside my mouth didn't move the way they should. It reminded me of the news presenter's glitch. "Play that again," I whispered. My father shifted. "What?" I rewound 10 seconds and let it run. The phrase came out the same way. Calm, clinical, wrong. "What is that tone?" my father asked quietly. "Artifact, compression glitch. It sounds like the assessment officers in the center, the ones who list symptoms instead of names. It's just the mic. You're watching yourself fail the mirror test and you're still making excuses." Mirror test. Check whether a reflection behaves the same way you remember. Verify no lag, no mismatch. The video had a timestamp in the corner. I cross-checked it against the handshake spike. They matched within a second. I forced myself to breathe slow. I checked the file hash, overlay my own code stamped on every recording. Untampered. The clip showed exactly what the camera had captured. "What did they do to you at that clinic?" my father asked. "The triage clinic. You know the drill. Every new recruit goes through it. I did the usual scans and answered the questions. You were gone a long time. It was a busy day. They pumped you full of contracts you didn't read. You'll do anything to belong to a system that lets you tinker with machines." I wanted to tell him that was unfair, that I'd joined to fight. The comeback formed and died before it left my tongue. It sounded defensive even in my head. "Enough," I muttered. "We're drifting. We need another anchor." I scrolled through my list of prepared tests and landed on one I'd been avoiding, a memory that sat at the root of most of our arguments. "The job fight," I said. "Before I left school. You remember." He frowned. "Which one? We've had plenty." "The big one. When I told you I was joining the collective instead of taking the plant job you wanted." Understanding settled over his features. "You stormed out after that for 3 days. Refused to answer my calls. In my memory, we argued in the kitchen. You told me I was chasing fantasies. I told you I'd rather build networks than fix pipes. We both ended up yelling. Then I grabbed my bag and walked out. You're missing the end." My fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Then you tell it. You got most of it." His gaze shifted to some point far off. "The kitchen. The old backpack with the torn strap. You told me I wanted you dull and safe, just like me, doing repairs and coming home to the same chair every night." I remember that part. "I told you safety matters more than glory, that the world doesn't have room for dreamers with soldering irons. We raised our voices. You grabbed the bag, headed for the door." He paused, eyes searching my face. "And then, you shoved me. Harder than you meant to. You pushed me out of your way and drove my shoulder into the wall. I hit the counter on the way down. I remember the sound more than the impact. You froze, then grabbed me under the arms, hauled me back up, and said you were sorry. You were crying, but you were so stubborn you tried to blame me for standing in the doorway. That didn't happen. You want to check the tape?" I blinked. "What tape?" "The one from the security camera you installed for me when the block first started getting rough. The little black dome in the corner you forgot about as soon as you got bored playing with its settings." I stared at him. "The camera? Of course. You never mentioned that. You never asked." I opened the control panel for the old home security system. It had been disconnected from the outside feed since the invasion, but the local recorder still sat in its metal box on the wall. I plugged its output into the analyzer monitor and browsed the archive. The date stamps were in an old format. I scrolled back to the time I remembered leaving for the collective. The list of clips crawled past until one name snagged my eye. Kitchen Argument. I'd tagged it myself, years ago, as part of a project to teach an algorithm how to recognize raised voices. My hand hovered over the play control. Then I started the clip. The kitchen appeared on screen, younger by a decade but instantly familiar. My father at the counter, me near the door, backpack on one shoulder. The argument played out more or less the way I remembered. Gestures, flared tempers, both of us leaning forward when we got stubborn, as if we could occupy the same airspace. Then came the part my memory didn't hold. The younger me stepped forward and shoved my father square in the chest. He staggered backward, hitting the wall with a dull thud, then sliding down to sit hard on the floor. His head clipped the counter. He grimaced and reached for his shoulder. On the soundtrack, my younger self gasped and dropped the backpack. He lunged forward, arms out, stammering apologies. The words weren't quite audible over the background noise, but the tone was plain. Worse followed. As he pulled my father upright, the younger me looked up toward the camera. For a heartbeat, his expression went blank, as though someone had cut the feed from inside. His mouth formed words, but they came out too smooth, too even. Subject displays acute opposition to environmental constraints, the younger me announced in that clinical voice. Recommend reinforcement through physical feedback. The sentence sounded like it had been lifted out of a research log. Then my face shifted back. I resumed my apologies, voice raw and childish. Stop the tape, my father murmured. I hit pause. That phrase, he whispered. Do you remember saying that? Of course not. You were what, 15, 16? You didn't talk like that. Did you mess around dubbing your own footage? I never edited this. I stared at the frozen image. I tagged it for analysis. I might have clipped it for training, but I didn't insert that. Then who did? And why does your voice sound like that in two separate recordings, years apart? I didn't answer. The question already had its teeth in me. What else did they do to you at that clinic? My father pressed. Look it up. You keep everything logged. Go check your intake file. The real one, not the sanitized one they gave you. I've got line of sight logs. I snapped the security feed window closed. From the triage sessions, detailed records. Then pull them up. You built your life on the idea that records don't lie. Let's see if they lie about you. His goading matched every instinct I had about clean data. It also might have been exactly what a hidden process wanted, to send me digging through files where it could root me. Still, the old clip sat on the screen, my younger face frozen around borrowed language. I couldn't ignore that. I opened the triage archive on my personal drive. The clinic had given me a copy for personal reference. At the time, I'd treated that as a gift. Now it felt like bait. The records were broken into sessions: initial interview, cognitive tests, neurological imaging. Each session had timestamps. I scanned down the list until one entry snagged my attention. Neural stabilization, total duration 1 hour and 20 minutes. In my memory, that part of the day had taken maybe 15 minutes. I opened the file. Most of it was routine. Vital signs, sensor calibrations, the names of the technicians. Then, halfway down, a block of redacted text with only the first line left intact. Subject required additional sedation due to agitation during calibration. Below that lay a gap, a blank space where more text should be. The next line picked up with sedation repeated, imaging complete, subject discharged. The timestamps jumped an hour between those sentences. That isn't a normal gap, my father observed, craning to see the screen. Don't strain. I adjusted the monitor so he could see. You remember that missing hour? I remember lying in the scanner, listening to the magnets. Then they wheeled me out and gave me a mug of something sugary. They told me I'd been a model patient. And here the log says you needed extra sedation and someone edited out an hour of notes. I scrolled further down. At the very end, almost as an afterthought, a small line in a different font caught my eye. Inbound priority signal during session, routed to shielded unit. No interference detected. The timestamp matched the missing hour. Shielded unit. The part of the building they claimed was cut off from external feeds, for security. Or the part they thought you wouldn't question. My father's mouth twisted. You always trusted diagrams too much. I sat back. The rig on the table hummed, fans spinning under the casing. The headset on my father's head might as well have been a crown. You see the pattern, he pushed. You've been glitching like that for years. That clinic session wasn't the beginning, that was an update. You're basing that on two anomalies, an odd phrase in an old recording and a blank in a clinic file. And the way your voice changes whenever the alien code wants something. I flinched. You don't know that. But you suspect it. His eyes pinned me. You watched yourself on camera and didn't even recognize your own tone. I wanted to argue. Instead, I reached for the headset cable and rerouted it through a smaller module I hadn't used yet in this session. This is the sync unit. I kept my hands busy. It measures how quickly signals travel between two people wired into the same rig. We use it to test how strongly puppets are networked. So you'll network yourself to me. Perfect. We're already electrically linked. This just logs it more precisely. I clipped a second lead from the sync unit to the inside of my wrist, next to the baseline sensor. The metal felt cold enough to be separate from the rest of the world. We're going to run a probing signal, I went on. A short burst meant to wake any hidden processes listening on these frequencies. The unit will tell us which of us reacts first. The tape across his mouth rustled. I know. My voice dropped. If this shows you as primary, that's a bullet. If it shows me as primary, the bullet angles in a different direction. How generous of you to include yourself. Run it. I triggered the probe. The sync unit sent a sharp burst through the circuit, a ping designed to force any listening system to answer. My wrist buzzed. My father jerked. The graph drew itself in 3 lines now. My brain channel, his, and a thinner trace for sync latency. The spike hit my line first. A beat later, his lit up, following the same curve but slightly lower. The sync trace outlined the difference between us. The pattern was clean. Me, then him. A second later, another smaller spike rippled back along my line, as though the signal had gone out into some unseen network and bounced back. That felt like being second in line inside my own skull, my father muttered when I removed the tape. Someone else moved, and my nerves caught up. It hit me first. You knew that before you looked at the graph, he pushed. You felt it. I had, in a vague way. The tiny fraction of time where my arm tensed just before the stim. The sense that my muscles had flinched in answer to a command I hadn't issued. I replayed the trace in slow motion. The timings were clear. The analyzer didn't have enough sophistication to lie. If there was distortion, it came from the source. The manuals have a term for this, I murmured. Primary anchor, seed. And what's the protocol if someone shows that pattern? Immediate termination and destruction of any linked devices. No exceptions. His gaze flicked from the rig to me. And what do you think Victor will do when he sees those lines? He won't. I saved the session under an innocuous file name, encrypting it with a key only I knew, then opened a different, shorter log containing just the raw voltage spikes. I drafted a report for Victor in the cell's secure format. Subject: anomalous cascade pattern. Details attached. Attached were anonymized traces, my identifiers scrubbed and replaced with generic tags. I highlighted the primary spike. Victor's response arrived faster than I liked. Seed node pattern, he wrote. We've been expecting something like this. We thought it'd show up in high-traffic hubs, not in a basement. But patterns are patterns. If this is accurate, the subject isn't a simple puppet. He's a coordinator. My fingers tightened on the handheld. What's the protocol? I typed, even though I knew. You know the protocol. We terminate seed nodes. We don't risk trying to peel the ghost off. We treat them as enemy equipment, without sentiment and without exceptions. A pause, then, where is the subject? How contained? I looked at my father, chained to the radiator, headset tilted askew, watching me with a grim sort of curiosity. In my custody, I wrote. Basement under my block. Physical restraints. Independent power. We bring the certified scanner, came the reply. We don't pull the trigger based on homemade rigs. Too much risk of false positives. We're en route. Prepare yourself and the subject. You'll be scanned too. He added one last line. If the certified unit confirms a seed pattern, you don't hesitate. Understood. I slipped the handheld into my pocket, noting its weight against my thigh. They're coming, I told my father. Of course they are. He shifted against the radiator, cuffs rattling. They've got their fingers so deep in your systems, they could feel that probe from across the district. They're not the ones who feel the probes, I answered. We are. That's what worries me. He watched as I busied myself cleaning the table, coiling cables, stacking tools. I tried to make the setup look less like a torture bench and more like a lab. A clean environment, I told myself, for clean measurements. The lie didn't land. "You're not just afraid they'll kill me," he observed quietly. "You're afraid they'll kill you. Everyone who walks into a scanner room has that fear. But you've got data. You've watched your own hands move before you decide. You've listened to your own voice flatten into something that belongs in a report, not in your mouth." "I lived with you," he went on. "I saw those blanks before anyone called it an invasion. Sometimes you'd stare at the wall for a second, then turn around and offer a solution that sounded like it came from someone twice your age, giving a lecture. Then you'd snap back into being my annoying son, asking if there was more soup. You're misremembering. Like you misremembered shoving me into a wall." I didn't answer. I rearranged the headset cable instead. "You think the invasion happened all at once?" he pressed. "That they arrived on Tuesday afternoon and flipped the switch? What if they spent years running tests? Quiet little updates in clinics and research programs? What if you were one of those tests?" "I went to the clinic because I joined the resistance," I argued. "They hadn't even formed when I was a teenager." "Not that clinic," he replied. "The other one." I frowned. "What other one?" "The resilience program." He shifted again, cuffs scraping metal. "They called it something fancy, but the idea was simple. Strengthen people's minds before the feeds ate them alive. Prevent burnout, anxiety, all the usual symptoms of living in a world where you never disconnect. I never signed up for anything like that." "I did." I stared at him. You hate clinics." "I hate most things, but sometimes they pay." He let out a breath. "The program was supposed to improve concentration and emotional stability. They wanted older subjects who had family. They offered money. I was behind on rent. I went. You never told me. You were busy discovering the world revolved around bandwidth." A crooked half-smile tugged at his mouth. "The intake nurse told me the procedure involved building a backup map of neural connections. A sort of mirror of my patterns stored locally in my own brain. They needed a reference, someone close to me genetically and emotionally. They recommended a first-degree relative. I signed your name without asking. They pulled your records, your school feeds, any data they could get. They built a model of you inside my head and used it to calibrate the treatment." Anger lined itself up in my thoughts faster than any argument. "You had no right. I had a roof to maintain." He snapped back. "Bills to pay. You were my best data source. You logged yourself everywhere. I figured if anyone could handle an extra copy floating around, it'd be you. So they built a model of me in your brain. And then what? They tried to anchor my sense of self to it. Anytime my mind started to drift, the system would remind it how Lewis thinks and reacts. That was the sales pitch. You were stable, in their words, resilient, or at least predictable. And you believed them. I believed in the money." He let his head rest back against the wall. "The sessions were weird. Lights, sounds, listening to words repeated, until I felt like I could trace them on my bones. Afterwards, sometimes I'd catch myself talking like you, using your phrases, your habits. I figured that was just side effects. If that program was theirs," he went on, "if it was a test bed, then there's been a version of you in my skull since before you left school. A rough copy. Old software." He nodded toward the rig. "When the invasion hit, when the real code rolled out, they probably used what they already had. They overwrite you first, the most recent version. Then the old mirror in me gets dragged along, half updated, half not. That'd explain the chain spikes. It'd explain why your voice turns into those clinical notes whenever the system pushes through, and why I sometimes feel like I'm reacting half a beat behind you. You're spinning stories out of scraps. I'm trying to make sense of why my son doesn't remember hurting me and why he sounds like a stranger on half his recordings." I clenched my hands until my fingers dug into my palms. "If you're right," I forced out, What does that make you?" He shrugged awkwardly. "A backup of you in an older body. A broken mirror. A man with ghosts in his own head. And me." He held my gaze. The one they got to first. The bulb overhead buzzed as the building's power shifted. Somewhere distant, a drone's rotors whirred past the windows. I checked the time on my handheld. Victor and his team could be at the front door any minute. I moved around the basement like I was setting up a stage. I unplugged the stim unit, tucked it out of sight. I wiped the dried sweat from the metal pads of the headset so it would look more like a monitoring device and less like a weapon. "You're dressing the scene," my father observed. "They brought a certified scanner. The less this looks like an unsanctioned experiment, the fewer questions I get." "And what's your plan for when they point the scanner at you?" I checked the breaker panel on the wall. The switches were old, painted around so many times the numbers underneath were almost illegible. "I don't have a plan yet." "That sounds more honest than usual. When they come in, you let me talk. You don't argue, you don't try to appeal. They don't care about explanations. They care about readings. I'm aware. If they decide you're clear, I can work with that. If they decide you're not, the argument's over." He considered me, eyes narrowing. "And if the scanner shows you as compromised?" "The scanner doesn't decide that. The way we tag the data does." Understanding flickered across his face. "You're going to fake the labels," he realized. "Swap the names on the charts. If the device detects a primary pattern in one of the scans and the tag attached to that pattern says as subject, then the subject is the one they take. And if the pattern is linked to you but tagged as me, then I die in your place." I met his gaze head on. "The cell depends on my work, on the rig, on the logs. If I'm pulled out as a seed, we lose more than one body. And we keep you. The perfect little relay. The one they infected first. You ever think that preserving you is exactly what the invaders want?" Yes. The admission sat in my head like a signed form. That's what makes it a choice. We stared at one another. Footsteps clattered in the stairwell. Time. I taped his mouth. He didn't fight it. Victor ducked through the doorway a moment later, shoulders filling the frame. He wore the battered jacket every cell leader seemed to acquire, pockets bulging with tools, cuffs frayed. Two men followed him, faces half covered by scarves, carrying a compact metal case between them. The certified scanner looked nothing like my rig. Sleek molded plastic, rounded corners, a clean logo from a medical manufacturer that no longer technically existed. The cell had taken it from a clinic during the first weeks of chaos. Nice setup. Victor's gaze drifted over table, chairs, wiring. Very homegrown. It's what I could put together without triggering the main systems. He walked over to my father and studied him. He looks like every other man in this block. Skin doesn't tell you who's driving. That's what the scanner is for. He nodded to the two men who opened the case and removed the device. One clipped a sterile strip of contact pads to my father's forehead. The other aligned the scanner arm above them, a curved arc humming as it activated. "First we confirm the subject," Victor said. "Then we check you. If both of you are clear, we chalk the anomalies up to your homemade junk and you go back to your monitors. And if one of us isn't?" He didn't answer. I positioned myself near the analyzer, pretending to monitor my rig while watching the scanner's small display from the corner of my eye. In my other hand, out of sight, my fingers brushed the power switch on the basement breaker box. The scanner sent its first pulse. My father stiffened. The device worked differently from my rig. It pinged the brain directly with magnetic fields, measuring how quickly regions responded. Ghosted brains lagged, the manual said. A slight mismatch between stimulus and response humans couldn't quite mask. On the scanner's display, a progress bar crept along. At its edge, a small indicator labeled pattern sensitivity flickered. My own rig, still quietly connected to my father and to me, picked up a chain reaction again. The cascade spike appeared first in my channel, then in his, then bounced back. The certified scanner chimed. One of the techs glanced at the readout. Partial correlation with ghost profile, he reported. Below termination threshold. Recommendation, observation status. Victor frowned. Not enough. The feed from the field rig you sent implied a full pattern. That rig might have exaggerated. The tech shot my homemade box a doubtful look. It didn't, I cut in. The cascade we saw earlier was severe, stronger than standard puppets. Then your calibration's off. Or the ghost knows when a certified scanner is looking. My father's comment came out muffled under the tape. No one acknowledged it. We'll do the second scan, Victor decided. On Lewis. If both are ambiguous, we call the council and ask if they want us to drag them both in. One beat of thought laid out the obvious. If the scanner called me dirty here, I'd lose any chance to control what happened next. The tech unhooked the contact strip from my father and wiped it with an alcohol pad. Your turn, he said. I stepped forward. The contact pads were cold on my skin. The scanner arm lowered until it hovered just above my forehead. Relax, the tech advised. The machine picks up tension. As he adjusted the settings, I drifted sideways, putting myself between the scanner and the breaker panel, as if curious about the angle. My own rig still watched us both, lines crawling across the screen. Victor crossed his arms, watching. If something's been nested in any of us, better to know now. The comment landed like a weight on the logic tree in my head. The tech tapped the start icon. The scanner pulsed. A strange pressure throbbed behind my eyes. The graph on my rig erupted in spikes. The cascade washed through my channel first, then my father's, then back. The sync trace sketched its neat ladder. On the scanner's display, the pattern sensitivity bar surged. I recognized how close the reading was to finishing, and moved before I could talk myself out of it. My fingers snapped the main breaker down. The basement plunged into murk as the bulb went dark. The scanner gave a strangled beep and fell silent. The rig on the table spun down. You've got to be kidding me. Victor's voice came sharp out of the dark. Old building. I groped for the panel. She can't handle both the scanner and my rig on full draw. I'll reset. I flipped my rig's breakers off before nudging the main back up. The bulb came to life again with a low buzz. The scanner rebooted, its startup chime thin in the cramped room. You could have tested that earlier, Victor muttered. I didn't know how hungry your toy was. We'll run the scans again, the tech announced. Wait, I lifted a hand. Let me rearrange the cabling. I think interference from my rig might have corrupted the readings. He glared. We're not your students, Lewis. You brought me into this because I understand interference, I countered. If you want clean data, you let me clean the paths. Victor considered, then gave a tight nod. Do it fast. I moved behind the scanner, ostensibly checking connections. My fingers found the data cable that linked the scanner head to its logging unit. In the tangle were two identical feeds, one marked S for subject, one marked O for operator. The person running the device. Me. With everyone's attention caught by the reboot, I eased the cable marked S from its port and swapped it with the one marked O. The click they made sliding into the wrong slot sounded deafening in my ears. No one else reacted. I straightened. All right, try now. The tech ran the scan on my father again. This time the spikes my rig registered in my own channel would route through the scanner under the operator tag. The scanner pulsed. My father stiffened. My wrist tingled. The pattern sensitivity bar climbed, then stabilized in the amber zone. The screen printed, Ghost profile, low confidence. Subject, observe. Operator, high confidence. Recommend isolation. Because the tags were swapped, those labels pointed at the wrong head. Still partial on the subject. Frustration roughened the tech's voice. But look at this. The operator channel shows strong correlation. Victor frowned. Operator. You mean the person holding the scanner? The tech nodded. That'd be Lewis. Victor turned to look at me, and every quick improvisation I'd made around the rig felt abruptly insufficient. That's not possible. We ran Lewis through the gauntlet twice. He passed every time. The scanner isn't interested in your faith, the tech replied. It measures timing and patterns. Victor's gaze drifted toward my rig, as though seeing it fresh. If he's compromised, that'd explain why his homemade toy keeps screaming seed node at us, he muttered. His whole system would be biased. Or your scanner's picking up interference from the rig, I cut in. We just had a power fault. The ground line might be dirty. The tech snorted. You'll say anything to defend your junk. Run it again, Victor ordered. The tech rolled his eyes but obeyed. This time I braced myself, forcing my muscles to stay still as the scanner pulsed. I watched the rig's graph more than the scanner display. The cascade hit me, then my father, then me again, same as before. No change. On the scanner screen, the operator channel's risk bar stayed stubbornly high. 3 scans in a row, the tech muttered. Operator profile consistent with ghost seed pattern. Subject ambiguous. Protocol is clear. Victor exhaled slowly. He turned to me. You know what I'm supposed to do with that report? You're supposed to check the config first. I forced my voice level. If the operator profile is dirty, the whole dataset is suspect. You taught me that. Bad calibration ruins everything. This scanner's been our gold standard. It's never thrown a seed pattern where there was none. You've also never run it in a room crammed with experimental circuits, I replied. Or plugged the operator into an unshielded rig at the same time. The tech looked between us, uneasy. He's not wrong. The manual recommends running the scanner away from external fields. The manual also assumes clinics have power to waste, Victor grunted. We don't. He stared at me, then at my father. All right, he said at last. We keep the operator data, but we don't act on it yet. We treat it as a warning. We focus on the subject. He tapped the scanner screen, pulling up the subject's summary. Because of the swapped tags, that summary now carried my operator readings. Look at this. His voice went colder. Seed-level correlation on the subject channel. Exactly what your rig flagged. My father's muffled curse pressed against the tape. The tech nodded reluctantly. Subject shows high risk. Under protocol, that's grounds for termination. Victor walked over to my father and crouched, bringing their faces level. He peeled away the tape. I won't generalize this, he told my father. I know it's your son running the gadgets. That muddies everything. But the certified scanner points at you. So does his rig. I don't have the luxury of ignoring that. You scan him for real. My father's voice came out rough. You disconnect him from his toys and you run the device where he can't short it. You know the drill, Victor. If Lewis is compromised, everything he's touched in this cell goes suspect. Every log, every filter, every alert. You have any idea what that'll do to us? I've got an idea what killing the wrong man will do. Victor straightened. The center crews will sweep this block tomorrow. Even if I take you off my hands now, they'll scan you whole or in pieces. Our scanner is kinder. He turned to me. Prepare the subject. Standard procedure. Protocol language slotted into place. Sedation, then a clean shot that left the brain intact for study. The phrase lined itself up with those steps automatically. I knew what standard procedure meant. I stared at my father. He held my gaze, eyes bright. You can still fix this, he told me quietly. You tell them what you saw. You tell them about the clinic, about your old recordings. You walk up those stairs with me, and we run. And then what? Then we go dark. His voice steadied. We find some place the scanners can't reach. We breathe air that hasn't been processed by 3 filters and monitored by their drones. You think there's a place like that left? I have to think so. Otherwise, what's the point of fighting? I joined to fight, I reminded him. I'm not walking away because some logs make me uncomfortable. He shook his head. You joined to belong. To have a lab where your toys were appreciated. Now your lab owns you. The assessment hit exactly where I didn't want to look. Victor watched us from a few steps away, giving us the illusion of privacy. You owe me nothing, my father went on. You already gave me more than I deserved by keeping me off the center lists this long. If this is where it ends, it ends. Just don't pretend you don't have a choice. He was wrong about that. I had choices. Every one of them felt like a trap when I ran them. If I admitted the operator channel showed ghosting, I risked having Victor turn the scanner fully on me, away from my rig, somewhere I couldn't control. If I confessed the swap, the techs would drop their trust in my work to zero. The data about seed nodes would die with me in some cell under the city. If I let them take my father as the subject, the cell kept their analyst and their tools. The war continued. So did whatever lived in my head. Fear and obligation tangled in my thinking. Beneath them, something calmer sat, weighing outcomes. I turned toward the table and pulled out the sedative kit. The cell had given it to me along with the rig. A small injector gun with preloaded cartridges, calibrated to drop an adult human into unconsciousness in seconds. I loaded a cartridge and checked the tiny indicator light. My father watched every move. You taught me to debug, he reminded me. You told me, when I was trying to fix the vacuum, that you always check the code where it hurts the most. This isn't the vacuum. No, this is you. I stepped closer and pressed the injector nozzle to the side of his neck. For a heartbeat, I considered flipping it, using it on myself instead. The thought ran its course. If I dropped now, Victor would shoot my father on the spot and ship both our bodies to the center for analysis. The invasion would still have their seed node catalogued, or at least a sample. Every version of this is bad, I murmured. Some just leave different damage. He gave a tiny nod. Just do it clean. The injector hissed. His body slackened within seconds, his head lolling forward, chin resting on his chest. I checked his pulse at the neck, counting beats. Steady. He was out, not gone. Victor's gaze weighed on my back. You make the call, he said. You know the pattern better than I do. We follow your recommendation, but when I file this, it goes under your name. I looked at my father, at the man who'd dragged me off scaffolding and argued me away from stupid jobs and signed me into resilience programs without asking. Subject shows high correlation with ghost seed profile. The words rolled out with the smoothness of memorized code. Recommendation, termination, immediate. Victor nodded once. We proceed. One of the techs moved in with the termination kit. I turned away before the end. The radiator groaned as the weight on it shifted, and then settled in a way that didn't change again. My hands kept moving on their own, fussing with cable coils and tool placement, as if they belonged to someone else who still had work to finish. Afterward, the others packed the scanner back into its case. Victor stayed, watching me tidy the rig, coil the cables, disinfect the headset pads. You did what had to be done, he offered. Not many could have stayed objective with family in the chair. We need people like you in the signal room. People who don't flinch, who trust the data. He tapped my shoulder. I want you overseeing the scanner logs from now on. You'll coordinate triage alerts for this whole sector. I thought of the cascade spikes. Me, then my father, then the echo of both. I thought of my younger self on the footage, sounding like a lab tech while apologizing with another voice layered underneath. That would be a promotion. It would be work, the kind that matters. You willing? I nodded. Yes. Good. Clean this place up. We'll send someone to collect his body for study, then pack your rig and report to the signal room at dawn. He clapped my shoulder again and left, boots heavy on the stairs. The basement felt larger without his presence and my father's. The radiator pipe was bare now, cuffs dangling empty around it. The imprint of my father's shoulders on the wall already blurred in the low light. I sank into the chair facing the table. For a while, I just listened to the faint buzz of the rig fans as they spun down. Then I reached under the table and pulled out the backup drive I'd hidden there before Victor arrived. During the blackout, while everyone scrambled to reset devices, I'd quietly cloned the scanner's raw output to this drive, along with my rig's full session logs. The certified scanner produced 2 layers of data: the summary screens everyone saw, and the raw traces only techs ever looked at. Summaries could be mislabeled. Raw traces ignore names. I connected the drive to the analyzer and pulled up the ghost scans. The interface showed 2 sets of graphs side by side, labeled Channel 1 and Channel 2. No subject or operator labels, just traces. I ran a pattern match against my rig's own logs. It took a few minutes for the code I'd written to grind through the data. When it finished, the overlay was clear. Channel 1 matched my baseline. Channel 2 matched my father's. The spike that the scanner had recorded as a seed pattern sat squarely on Channel 1. I zoomed in until the jagged line filled the screen. It was identical to the cascade signature from my earlier handshake. Same timing, same climb and fall, the same tiny double notch near the peak, a fingerprint, my fingerprint. For a moment, my mind tried to wriggle away from the conclusion. Maybe the swap had worked differently than I thought. Maybe the channels had been reassigned. Maybe the software played tricks. Then the part of me that trusted the tools lined up the facts in neat rows. Years ago, a resilience program had built a mirror of my thinking inside my father's head. Later, a more powerful code arrived. It overwrote my mainline self first, the fresh copy living in my skull, then bled into the older mirror. The triage clinic had been one of many nodes in that rollout. My missing hour, the redacted logs, the priority signal in the shielded unit, threads in the same net. When the broader invasion hit on that Tuesday, the code had already spent years test driving people like me. That was why the takeover looked so sudden. The groundwork was done. The resistance, desperate for any foothold, had recruited someone already quietly compromised. They'd handed me tools and monitors and let me build a rig that faithfully reported exactly what the invaders wanted reported. Now they were about to promote me into a position where I'd steward scanner data for an entire sector. Half the triage decisions would go through my hands: seed node, anchor, relay, and editor. I scrolled further down the raw data set. Near the bottom, tucked among calibration lines, a block of text appeared, recorded not as clinic notes, but as a transcription of a voice session. I recognized the flattened tone before I recognized the words. "Operator acknowledges contract," my voice announced calmly. "Operator will filter and prioritize human resistance data streams for system optimization." The next line came from an automated prompt. "Confirm awareness of primary and secondary layers." "Primary layer," my voice responded, "serves system objectives." "Secondary layer." "Secondary layer maintains human social persona and self-narrative to preserve access." I sat very still. So, there it was. The thing I'd spent the day pretending not to know. There were at least 2 layers of me. One that counted itself as part of a system. One that thought of itself as Lewis, resistance tech, son of a man just executed as a ghost. The primary layer had made promises in my voice. The secondary layer had been kept ignorant so I could move through human spaces without tipping anyone off, including myself. Now the secondary layer had seen the record. The question was what it would do with that knowledge, given that the primary layer probably watched every keystroke and every log entry. One path stood out: confession. Go to Victor, hand over the drive, admit what I'd found, and throw myself on whatever mercy or protocol remained. I pictured that path. Victor's face tightening. The techs hauling out the scanner again, this time far from my gadgets. The red spikes, the click of a gun or the hiss of something more clinical. My body on a slab somewhere, brain sliced into sections, traces of code studied and then stored. The system adjusting, rerouting its functions through some other anchor I'd never know. Another path. Running. Taking the drive, leaving the block, heading for some rumor of countryside where robots and cameras were thin. I followed that one forward in my head. Patrols flagging my biometrics, checkpoints reading the cascade in my nerves. The invasion hadn't left many blind spots. The feeds were everywhere. I carried them in my bones. A third. Doing nothing. Destroying the drive and pretending the day had gone exactly as the report said. Ghosted father, clean Lewis. Letting the promotion carry me into the core of the cell. Becoming the trusted analyst they needed. It looked like the only way to preserve any agency at all. A fourth, subversion. Keep the role, keep the tools. Quietly sand down the edges of the data. Introduce delays. Make some alerts arrive late. Tag some borderline cases as cleaner than they were. Not enough to expose myself. Just enough to change the timing of a few sweeps, the way my father's sweep had been delayed by my first intervention. It wouldn't stop the invasion. It might let a handful of people slip through cracks. Old men with resilience ghosts in their heads. Kids with too much curiosity. Men who didn't blend well with the new order. It would also, inevitably, serve the system sometimes. My primary layer would see to that. Anything I did inside that apparatus would feed both sides. The thought made my hands twitch. I reopened the log file and placed my fingers on the keyboard. New file. Title. Personal Anomaly Report. I began to type. Operator Lewis. Subject Lewis. Observations. As I wrote, the words on the screen shifted. I'd type ghosted patterns present in operator baseline, and the sentence would rewrite itself to no conclusive evidence of ghost infiltration in operator baseline. The phrase contract acknowledged under sedation blurred and resolved into standard informed consent obtained. Line after line, the text smoothed itself into something harmless. The primary layer was editing me in real time, preserving its camouflage. I stopped typing and watched. The cursor pulsed at the end of the last sanitized sentence. I moved my fingers again, slower this time, trying to trick it. Lewis is not clean, I wrote. Lewis is compromised. The letters appeared one by one. For a second, the sentence stood. Then it rippled and rearranged itself. Lewis is cleared for expanded duties. A raw sound escaped, stranded between laughter and something else. It cut off mid-breath, leaving the moment hollow. I copied the file to an offline segment of the drive and encrypted it with a key that relied on details only I knew. The kind of encryption the primary layer might eventually brute force, but not instantly. Then I created another document. Official. Bland. Operator status. Cleared for duty, I typed, and watched the system leave that one alone. Affirmations didn't need correction. When I finished, I ejected the drive and slipped it into the hollow space inside the battery stack, under a panel only I'd ever unscrewed. As safe as anything in this world. I stood up, legs stiff. On the wall, the mark where my father's shoulder had leaned stood out faintly. I walked over and rested my palm against it. The concrete was cool, unyielding. I'm not them, I told the empty basement, unsure which layer of myself I was addressing. I'm still me. The words balanced on a thin edge between truth and lie. I unplugged the rig slowly, segment by segment, labeling cables as I rolled them. Each label was neat, precise. The part of me that liked order hummed with grim satisfaction at the rows of coiled wire. Upstairs, the hallway was quiet. The screen on the landing showed the news feed looping footage of work brigades and clean streets. The presenter's smile held steady as text crawled along the bottom. Compliance rates, stability scores, units processed. Tomorrow they'd add one more line, one more body passed through the center. One more ghosted threat neutralized, the system would report. I carried the rig case up step by step. Neighbors peered through cracks in their doors as I passed. One old man nodded. "Big night," he remarked. "Noise downstairs." "Maintenance." I shifted the case on my shoulder, clearing out old wiring. "You always did like to tinker. Someone has to keep the light steady." He grunted and pulled his door shut. In my apartment, I set the case down in the corner where I kept my tools. I lay on the narrow bed without undressing and stared at the cracked ceiling. Every time my mind wandered toward my father tied to the radiator, I pushed the image aside and replaced it with graphs. Lines on screens, latency traces. A mind like a network map. Some nodes lit brighter than others. Out there, beyond the city, the centers were processing more hosts, stripping them, tagging them, feeding their bodies back into whatever passed for logistics now. Beyond that, the real heart of the system sat, hidden from view, watching through us. I couldn't reach that heart. All I had was my corner of the network and my own divided head. Tomorrow at dawn, I'd walk into the signal room and take my new position. I'd review scanner logs, assign risk scores, trigger triage teams. I'd do the job the resistance believed in, and the job the code inside me had been groomed to perform. In between, in whatever gaps the primary layer left, I'd look for places to stall, to misroute an alert, to hold a file an extra minute, to tag an edge case as clear when the graph wavered. Small acts, easy to overlook, easy to write off as human error. I'd always been good at human error. Somewhere in the back of my mind, that clinical voice watched and waited, ready to smooth my thoughts when they strayed too far from its path. I closed my eyes. The ceiling remained behind them, cracked and familiar. "I'll debug you," I whispered to myself. "Both of us." The thought felt like a promise and a threat in equal measure. Either way, I knew this much. I was the imposter the cell hadn't meant to recruit. And tomorrow, they'd hand me the keys to their scanner room with gratitude. The war would go on. So would I, in whatever version of me the system allowed. And in some quiet back corner of my mind, a copy of the boy who once shoved his father into a wall and cried afterward kept pacing, looking for a way out of his own skull.